So let's start with the 8A data. I found just yesterday that the number of 8A participants actively in the program is now below 3,400. Let me see for people who are on the live stream. You can see it there in the uh, screen share. The We started the year at over 4,300 8A participants. And to give this kind of historical context, the number of 8A participants used to be around 5,000. So it's dipped significantly now to less than 3,500. The reason for this, of course, is SBA's continued audit of the 8A program. Now, most of the firms that have left the program have done so because they either withdrew or they were terminated for not suspending or not replying to the data call. So at first, these firms were suspended for not replying to the data call. Then they were terminated. That happened around the middle of August. Those firms were terminated. And then there were a number of firms that just decided, look, it's really not worth it for me to stay in the 8A program, particularly with what the agency is doing with here, let me make this a little bit easier to see with what the agency is doing in terms of sole sources and cutting back on the once 8A, always 8A rule. So you can see here that you had almost 500 firms that were eliminated from the program between August 8th and August 13th. And that's because of firms leaving or firms that were terminated for not replying to the data call. There are still 114 firms that got unsuspended today. It seems to be a Friday thing to try to go and unsuspend firms. So that number may have dipped since I created this graph. But right now we're at fewer than 3,400. And you can probably expect for that number to continue to go down. SCBA just is not. There haven't been new applications that have been granted, at least in what I've seen since August of 2025. And then you additionally have these firms that are just graduating naturally after their 9 or 10-year period, but firms that are finding that the 8A program isn't giving them the return that they expected. And I'll be going through some of that data as well in response to one of your questions that came up when I brought up this data before. But let me go now to SBA's budget request. The this is really interesting when it first came out. The White House issues, I guess, a proposed budget, Office of Management and Budget, proposed budget every year, but it it's really the House that sets the budget. So the White House proposal is just kind of a signal to people of what the White House priorities are. And the White House budget this year cut SBA by 67%. So you go to the White House budget and it it says the budget requests $330 million for the SBA, a 670 million or 67% decrease from the 2026 enacted level. So the White House would have cut the entrepreneurial development programs, would have cut completely the SCORE program. It would have cut salaries and expenses by a third. It would have cut the business loan programs by 160 million. So people watching that kind of figure, look, this is you're not going to cut SBA by 2/3. It's a really bad signal to say, okay, we're not supporting small businesses through SBA support anymore. And lo and behold, the House Appropriations Committee issued a draft budget for consideration, and it does not cut the SBA by 67%. It keeps most of the programs at the same level as they have been before. The SBA salaries and expenses goes down by about 25 million, so that's far less than what the White House had proposed. It's less than a 10% cut for salaries and expenses. It also keeps the entrepreneurial development programs at a bit less than what they had before, maybe a bit more than a 10% cut, but still they keep score around in some of those programs. Keeps Office of Inspector General at a level, the same level, and Office of Advocacy, interestingly, gets a boost. Office of Advocacy gets an additional $4 million in this budget from the House Appropriations Committee. The budget states that the Office of Advocacy was established by Congress in 1976 to serve as the independent voice for small business within the federal government. Interesting timing for that statement because the prior chief of that office, the chief counsel for SBA, recently switched jobs. The chief counsel was Casey Mulligan. He's a renowned economist from University of Chicago, and he was a Senate confirmed chief counsel. There hadn't been a Senate confirmed chief counsel at SBA for, gosh, 10 years or something. It'd been quite a long time since SBA had a chief counsel. And he was in this job for, gosh, about a year, it looks like, and then switched over to be an economist at HHS. So the SBA has named an acting chief counsel. It's Everett Waddell. He was the acting administrator when President Trump was first elected. So there's not a permanent chief counsel in that position, and kind of questionable whether the advocacy is acting as an independent voice established by Congress if there's not a Senate confirmed head of that office. Uh, some good statements in the report for the House Appropriations budget for SBA. One of them about the women-owned small business program. The committee states in its report that it's concerned about the women-owned small business program having a month-long backlog of applications. The increased number of certified firms in the program, as well as the recent surge of participants undergoing an in-depth recertification process as they enter their third year, has added an additional strain on the program's resources. The committee directs SBA to ensure that eligible applicants obtain the required initial certification and continued certification to meet SBA's goal of supporting women-owned businesses. A significant development there with the House Appropriations Committee putting a spotlight on a backlog in the women-owned small business program. I had seen recently that SBA is pushing through applications on the women-owned small business program. In one day, they had approved over 250 applications, and I've seen it myself as well of women-owned small business applications getting approved. So they may be heeding this guidance from the Appropriations Committee to get through this backlog of applications on the women-owned small business program. The Appropriations Committee is also interested in the 8A program. Number one, they've taken on this mantle of looking at new entrants. This has been a sticking point for SBA and policymakers for quite some time, and the Appropriations Committee notes that the number of new entrants, that's the number of small business new entrants, those small businesses entering new contracts, declined 80% during the period between 2005 to 2019. You see this issue come up again and again. SBA highlighted it in its scorecard changes. We'll be talking about that in a bit, and is looking to add that as a factor to the scorecard. And here it is, the House Appropriations Committee also paying attention to the decline in new entrants. And the committee links that with actions that we've already talked about in the 8A program. It states that recent actions undertaken by the SBA are exacerbating the decline in new entrants, particularly in the 8A contracting program. So you're seeing, 8A is a way for companies to get into government contracting for the first time. They're able to get sole source contracts, so they don't necessarily have to compete and have that deficit in past performance because they're new. They can get sole source contracts, and they have limited competition against other 8A firms when they do have to get into a competitive atmosphere. But the committee is directing here SBA to look closely at the 8A program and report to the Committee on Appropriations on the statutory and legal justifications for terminating 622 small businesses on March 4th, and then also include the statutory and legal justification for initiating SBA's June 2025 audit of the program. The report should include the results of the June 2025 audit and evidence of fraud and/or improper payments on the 8A program, supporting the removal of these small businesses from the program. So that's language I hadn't heard before, that there could be improper payments in the 8A program. I suppose SBA is really looking at eligibility. Are companies meeting the disadvantage requirements of the program? And so maybe they're thinking that if the company is not eligible, that it could potentially be an improper payment to have paid a company that's not qualified for the program. I think that'd be a bit of a stretch with looking at firms that might be, a few $1,000s over the economic disadvantage threshold. That's a lot of the firms that have been suspended or considered for termination. As to those 628 small businesses that were removed, that was that big jump in that red line that I showed on the graph. And that's primarily firms that didn't reply to the data call. Remember, I had this conversation with Matt Schoonover a while back. It was very expensive for firms to reply to the data call, thousands of dollars, tens of thousands of dollars. And firms may not have seen the return on investment in replying to the data call. But now Congress, through the House Appropriations Committee, first of all, not cutting SBA by 67% as the White House had proposed, but also putting a spotlight on the women-owned small business program and the 8A suspensions and terminations. One other note in this is there's a provision in here, Section 520, that is drafted to prohibit small businesses from having to comply with Section 1071 of the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act. That's loan reporting. And Section 1071 was passed in like 2010. So it's 15 years old and has just been kind of running around regulatory procedures for a while and not gone into effect. So a further delay in the enactment of Section 1071 from this committee report here. Uh, let's get into some case law, and I'm going to go back to some of this data when I get into questions. A few cases that have come out. I'm going to have a podcast next week with Scott Flesh, who's one of the best protest lawyers, if not the best protest lawyer out there now. And so we're going to go over a lot of court cases and protest decisions that have been coming out. We'll also talk about the executive order on fixed price contracting that just came out. So I'm going to save some of those till next week when I talk with Scott. But I couldn't stop from highlighting this decision that came out from GAO just this week called Creanet. This is about a reprocurement case. So this is an 8A contract that was reprocured by the agency. And it's interesting because this is honestly, I've been around federal procurement now for almost 20 years. I have not seen a reprocurement. I think I've talked about it. I think I've thought about it, but I'm not sure that I've actually seen one in the flesh. So these do not come up very often. So it's interesting to see this area of law arise. But Creanet is protesting a task order to LBO Technology. There was an RFQ under the GSA schedule set aside for 8A firms, and Creanet and LBO were two of the firms that submitted quotes on that. Creanet actually won the initial competition in February of 2025. There were some protests, and Creanet had some personnel changes during the course of that time that they were waiting to perform on the contract. The agency had some concerns in Creanet's failure to provide proposed key personnel in a timely manner. The agency issued a cure notice, and ultimately the agency terminated Creanet's task order for default. And then the agency did eventually convert that termination to a no-cost termination for convenience. But the SBA issue that comes up in this happens after the agency goes to issue a task order to LBO. So this is back off the original competition way back in 2024. The agency goes back and asks LBO for a revised quotation and then issues the task order to LBO after terminating Creanet's task order for lack of those key employees. And the area of law that comes up is the process under reprocurements, FAR section 49.402-6 covers reprocurements. It says an agency has considerable discretion to repurchase goods and services for a substitute contract where the agency seeks to repurchase goods or services in a quantity not exceeding the undelivered quantity. It may use any acquisition method, provided that it observes competition to the maximum extent practicable. And GAO has said it will not review an agency decision to exclude a defaulted contractor from a reprocurement for the remaining work under the defaulted contract. So Creanet brings up a number of arguments. The one that I paid most attention to was an argument about SBA certificate of competency procedures. So the certificate of competency is rarely seen but often discussed. It comes up in a number of GAO cases, Court of Federal Claims cases from time to time, and it's really, it's kind of a historic process. There used to not be as many set-asides, and a lot more contracts used to be lowest price or sealed bidding. So a small business would bid against larger businesses, and it might have the lowest bid, but the agency would deny the small business the contract because it'd say the small business doesn't have the capacity to do the work. It's too small, basically, or it doesn't have the past performance to do the work. It's too small to be able to do this contract. So Congress and SBA created this process called Certificate of Competency, where that small business that is excluded from a contract, even though it has the top rated proposal, or even though it has a lot lowest price, can appeal to SBA for a certificate called a COC, Certificate of Competency. And if SBA grants that certificate, then the agency would need to award the contract to the small business under the COC. That's the way historically it was designed. It doesn't quite work that way anymore because of two-step procurements, and then you have a lot of no-go, go decisions on past performance. But Creanet here is trying to use the COC procedures to make the case that the agency needed to allow it the opportunity to appeal to SBA to be considered for the follow-up task force. Now, remember, Creanet's the company that just got terminated. So it has a number of other arguments, but on this argument, GAO says we're not even going to consider that because GAO says that under the procedures for reprocurement, when a company is defaulted and the agency reprocures, GAO has said the statutes and regulations governing federal procurements do not apply, and the COC process does not apply because of that. So that's another reason that agencies can avoid using the COC appeal process. We saw another one with the C-slope case. I may be talking about that with Scott Flesh, where the agency was able to make the case that it did not use a go, no-go procedure, that it was a comparative evaluation, and the agency was able to avoid the COC procedure in the C-slope case. Here in Creanet, the agency is able to avoid it because the procurement, the award to LBO is conducted under a reprocurement in FAR Part 49. So I will keep this case in mind in case I ever have to run into a reprocurement. Very interesting set of facts. Then another GAO case, which is significant for anybody who works on SBIR, Small Business Innovation Research, came out recently. It's called ThreatTech. And that name may sound familiar in the context of SBIR cases because there was a Court of Federal Claims decision about the stay procedures, the SICA stay procedures involving ThreatTech as well, that came out just a few weeks ago. We'll be talking more about stays in the next episode with Scott Flesh. But the stay, eventually what happened in that Court of Federal Claims case was that ThreatTech was denied the override of the stay, or denied the challenge to the override of the stay. We've got a couple of things layered on top of each other, but so the agency was able to override the stay during the GAO case. And now we see the GAO decision coming out in ThreatTech about small business innovation research. And the outcome of this case is that you have to pay really close attention to who wins and who loses an SBIR award, because ThreatTech had its protest dismissed not on the substance, but on timeliness. It got dismissed on timeliness because the agency had selected a company, Chitra, Chitra, that was under SBIR Phase 3. Chitra Productions LLC, Virginia Beach, had was awarded under SBIR Phase 3, and ThreatTech did not know that when it brought the protest. It did not have the information that this was awarded under SBIR Phase 3. ThreatTech actually protested in part because the agency did not give an explanation as to why Chitra was able to receive the award. So the agency very quickly in the protest response, I think just a week after the protest was filed, less than a week, it was like 5 days after the protest was filed, the agency told ThreatTech, "Hey, we made this award to Chitra, and it's under Phase 3." So Chitra now has that information, and there there's some back and forth, but finally, the Chitra on February 17th files a protest at GAO, an additional protest, supplemental protest, stating that Chitra hasn't received an SBR Phase 1 or Phase 2. So how can it possibly receive a Phase 3? That's what Phase 3 is. It's a follow-on to a SBIR Phase 1 or Phase 2 award. You can't get a Phase 3 unless you've gotten an SBIR Phase 1 or a Phase 2. Now, the agency has an explanation for it. You don't see this in GAO cases very often, so it's interesting that it's even discussed in a GAO case. But the agency is claiming that Chitra is a successor in interest to another company's Phase 2 contract. So Chitra had purchased IP and technology from a company called Architecture Technology Corporation that had won a Phase 2. And that technology is what led to this Phase 3 acquisition. And the agency said the technology it's going to use in this Phase 3 contract is the same technology that ATC, our Architecture Technology Corporation, had designed under the Phase 2 contract. So ThreatTech tries to challenge that. It says, there's stuff about the DEC standard derives from extends or completes. Maybe it's arguing it's not actually successor to interest, but they don't even get there because if you pay attention to the dates, the agency had told ThreatTech, or very early on, within 5 days of filing the protest, that Chitra was the company, and then it gotten under Phase 3. So at that point, GAO says the clock starts to challenge Chitra's SBIR Phase 3. You can't wait until you get more information from the agency in a request for dismissal or further filing. Uh, the reason is you can look up all of this stuff on SBIR.gov. You can look up who's won an SBIR Phase 3 award. The GAO quotes the SBIR.gov website as having every SBIR award since the program's inception. SBIR.gov has every SBIR award since the program's inception. And it says this is a publicly available government source. It's the same source the agency used when it conducted its search. So here there's an expectation then that ThreatTech can't wait to find out that Chitra is the successor to interest to this architecture firm. Instead, ThreatTech has the information at the time that it knows the identity of the company to go search the SBIR.gov database and find out that the company is not in the database. And the GAO also goes through some of the discussion about the successor to interest argument, and it says we note in any case we've considered the argument that it's not a successor in interest, and determined ThreatTech has not given us a reason to question the agency's judgment. So interesting there that once you know what the company is, you got to go and find out what your challenges are to that company right away. You can't wait until you get further explanation from the agency. GAO says a protester may not passively await information providing a basis for protest. ThreatTech did not file a timely supplemental protest challenging Chitra's eligibility, and therefore its second supplemental protest was untimely. On that note, with SBIR, most people probably heard this, but the SBIR program was reauthorized through the Small Business Innovation and Economic Security Act. That was became law April 13th. It was signed by the president, and it creates a new program, strategic breakthrough allocations for critical technology areas. That's higher value SBIR awards that have to have a match to them. It also allows or requires agencies to set a maximum number of proposals per fiscal year that a company can submit in response to a phase one or phase two solicitation. That had been a big issue with the multiple award winners. Are we going to try to cap the number of awards? So here it's a cap on the maximum number of proposals, and that's set by the agency. There's no specific cap in the legislation. Also expands requirements for federal agencies to evaluate the security risks for small businesses that apply for awards. And if the agency denies an application for security reasons, the agency must provide the small business with the basis for such determination. So we've heard from companies that are getting denied, they don't get a reason. So this legislation requires the agency to provide the basis for that. So that's the new Public Law 11983 extending the SBIR program. It gets 5 years, so it's now through 2031, through fiscal year 2031. Hopefully, we don't have to deal with all this uh, stress and back and forth on the SBIR program when it gets to 2031. On the OHA front, OHA's been busy with the suspension appeals. Let's see, 714 is the last one I saw. These are numbered sequentially, so you can kind of see how many they've done. Let me see. 714 is still the last one. So they number all these cases. And at the beginning of this, they were at 638. So they're now at 714, which means they've done upwards of 80 cases, upwards of 80 suspension cases. All of these are dismissed. We have not seen a substantive suspension decision. For the most part, they're dismissed because SBA has told the OHA judge that they've let the company back in the program. I think a lot of what happened here is companies got suspended because they didn't reply to the 8A data call, and they filed an appeal at OHA. They also filed the response to the data call with SBA at the same time. So now that they filed the response to data call, SBA can take them off the suspension list. So that means that the SBA can let them back into the program to and OHA. Even if that happens, even if there's really not a whole long period of suspension, OHA still issues the decision. For firms that are suspended, they get that time that they were suspended back on their 8A term. So if you're suspended for 30 days, you get an extra 30 days at the end of your 8A term. So you still get the full 9 or 10 years in the program, even if you're suspended from the program because of not replying to the data call. Now, there are a number of companies that have been suspended because of concerns with their economic disadvantage. They may be over, or at least from SBA's view, they may be over some of the thresholds for economic disadvantage, 400,000 for income, 850,000 net worth, 6.5 million for assets. Some of those suspensions are coming through in these decisions as well. So there's probably uh, all told, well over 100 cases that have reached OHA, but many of them have been dismissed, and for the most part, it's because the company has gotten back in. I'm sure there are companies in here that have withdrawn from the program as well during the course of time and just seek not to continue to push their suspension. There are a couple of substantive cases out of OHA. Let me see if there's any good ones here. So we do have a case called Nisu. I may be trying to set up something about Nisu in the future, so I won't go too far into it, but it's an interesting identity of interest case. So you don't see identity of interest come up in these OHA cases as an affiliation ground very often. I think there was a point in time where identity of interest was a much bigger deal, but in the last few years, it seems to have waned in importance, potentially because of the way the um, maybe economic dependence has changed. Kind of made a big exception that swallows the rule to the economic dependence rule. But identity of interest comes up a lot with familial relationships. people that are related can have this identity of interest ground for affiliation, and those were the facts here. But OHA, these happen in multiple stages. SBA finds a firm to be affiliated or not affiliated, then OHA reviews it. At the SBA stage, the SBA had found the firms to be affiliated because I believe it was a mother-daughter, or sorry, father-daughter relationship, and the father was an executive at one firm, and the daughter was the head of an 8A company, and they were doing business together, including through a mentor protege relationship. The area office found affiliation, which would cause them to lose the contract that they were going after. Let's see if I can find out what the contract was. Air Force contract for sustainment restoration and modernization. So they're affiliated, they lose the contract, but OHA actually reversed that decision, granted the appeal, and vacated the decision, actually, not reversed it. OHA granted the appeal, vacated the decision, and remanded it to the area office. So I'll be tracking that and see if we can have more discussion about that in the future. Let's see, there's another OHA case here. Let's see a good one. Uh, uh, the SBA scorecard has made it into the news lately. There was an article I was actually quoted in it by Jason Miller in the Federal News Network about changes to the SBA scorecard. I know a bit about the SBA scorecard. I used to run the SBA scorecard. I was quoted in the article as saying, "Look, it's probably time to change the SBA scorecard because it's been about the same for 9 to 10 years, and the administrator has the ability to change it within some statutory confines." I pointed out in an article earlier that the numbers that were put out online didn't actually add up to 100. It was 110%. And apparently, SBA heard a little bit about that from Congress. There was a letter that was uh, summarized in the Jason Miller article that went from the ranking member on the House Small Business Committee, Nydia Velasquez, to SBA, pointing out that, look, these numbers don't add to 100, they add up to 110. And I think the biggest impact, as I noted back when I first looked at the scorecard, is on the trade-off between 8A and veterans. The 8A used to be a big emphasis for the scorecard in the Biden administration because that administration raised the goal for small disadvantaged businesses to 15%. And in federal contracting, the only way that you can target small disadvantaged businesses is through the 8A program. So that was a bigger use of the 8A program encouraged by the scorecard under the Biden administration. Here, this administration is seeking to emphasize veterans. So it's added veterans into the disadvantaged business category. They've created this economic disadvantage category and say veterans are presumptively economically disadvantaged. That veterans also have another category, the service disabled veteran owned category. So it's not clear whether that overlaps. Are you only counting veterans that are not service disabled for that? Or are you going to double count service disabled veterans for that? And then there's additional elements in the scorecard that considers veterans. There's actually a standalone category called serving our veterans that is worth 15% of the scorecard and says that increasing award dollars and outreach to service-able veterans and veteran-owned small businesses could earn agencies that 15% of the scorecard, although I'm not sure if it's going to stay 15% if it adds up to 110. I told Jason Miller this in the article. My general view on the scorecard is it can be effective for a bit. It leads to a letter grade, good for agencies to get A's. They want to get A's. People are expecting them to get A's. But I think it's more important to hold agencies to the actual numerical goal. So there's a 5% service-able veteran-owned goal. Department of War does not meet that 5% goal. Many agencies do. VA is like over 25%. So they meet that goal. But a lot of agencies don't meet that goal. I think it's more important to hold agencies to those goals than it necessarily is to get them an A, because you can see here with that, okay, you get 15% for increasing outreach. What does that really mean? How do you get that 15%? So these things can go back and forth on the grade, and sometimes you can work the grade a little bit, just like you can in high school and college, but you can't work the numbers. The numbers are what they are, and agencies that don't meet their numerical goals should be held to account. I would focus more on those than I would on the grades. There was the going over to other regulatory developments. There was the executive order that I discussed in my last podcast on addressing DEI discrimination. The FAR Council came out very quickly with its deviations for that executive order. They had a 30-day deadline and they did it ahead of that deadline, which is pretty incredible that they were able to do that. I think they actually did it the day before I filmed the podcast. I would have talked about it otherwise. The deviations are very similar to what you saw in the executive order. I'll be talking about that a bit with my next podcast guest, Scott Flesh. But the timelines are very aggressive on these deviations, and they also include incorporation into existing contracts. So by July, agencies should look at incorporating the deviations into existing contracts through a bilateral modification. It says if a contractor refuses to agree to a bilateral modification, the contracting officer should consider whether, absent the modification, the contract no longer meets the agency's needs and should therefore be terminated for convenience. So that's a good reason for the contractors to strongly consider allowing the modification to the contract, because otherwise the contracting officer will strongly consider whether it might be terminated for convenience. But we'll be talking about that more in the future. Okay, I'm gonna go to questions that I've received online, first in the articles, and then if there are any in the chat, I'll go over those questions too. So on the last podcast that I had with in North Carolina, I talked about AI legal risks and what law firms were doing with AI, what government was doing with AI. There was the GSA clause on AI, and there's a good question in there in the comments about what about government using AI as part of source selection? And if the RFP states that the government is using AI to help in source selection, is that protestable? Particularly since there aren't any bumpers or guardrails for AI. I think that's happening. I've seen it out there. Lowfield Consulting is putting out some information about AI and source selection, how to deal with that. I think we've seen it with SBA already, with the terminations and suspensions. It looks like a lot of these suspension letters are at least combed through by AI, if not written by AI. And yes, is that protestable? If it's unreasonable, then certainly it is. I think that's why you see so many suspension appeals at OHA, and seeing that OHA is dismissing those because SBA is lifting those suspensions. A few of those suspensions might be lifted because AI got it wrong when it was going through and looking through all these files. And I think you could look at the same with AI in source selection. I mean, I always thought of it as um, you have inherently governmental tasks, and source selection is inherently governmental. You're not supposed to have contractors rating proposals. Shouldn't it be the same way for AI? Could we use the inherently governmental guidance to say, well, there has to be a human looking at this as well, because an AI is conducted through a contract. I suppose, because you have an AI government employee, I guess you'd have to develop the AI yourself within the government. I don't think that's happening. So I want to have some sort of explanation as to why the government is doing what is inherently governmental tasks under the OMB memo using AI. I'm sure it's happening though, and especially with government employees leaving because of the fork, or because of rifts, or there's this Article 2 decision that came out recently. Government employees leaving because of that. There's just fewer government employees around, so whether they're directed to by their agency or not, I'm sure there's AI that's being used in procurement. But yes, is it protestable? The AI is going to make mistakes. It's probably going to make a lot more mistakes than the humans will. We talked about that with Jackson Moore as to how many mistakes judges are pointing out during protests and the such. So those mistakes are certainly protestable, no question. Then I got a question. I have some data for this, so I'm excited to talk about this question. Major Clark, who used to be the acting chief counsel for advocacy, he asked, "What's the impact of the transition away from 8A sole source contracts on Alaskan and Native American businesses? And then what are the characteristics of the small businesses that are winning sole source contracts?" So let, I won't share my screen on this, but I went back and looked at the data, updated it for 8A sole source awards. Now, this is in the context of my article that said 8A sole source contracts have cratered. They were down, or they were 50% more in previous years. In 2004, I look back at 2004 because 2005 is a Doge year. But I'm sorry, 2024. 2024, they were about 870, and then 2026, they fall to 590. So pretty big decrease, about a 40% decrease in 8A source sources. Who's getting those? Well, at this point in the year, so we're about a month after I published that article, we're now at 772 8A sole sources. Still considerably down when you consider there were almost 900 the previous year and also a month earlier. I didn't look at this number for previous years, but 772 as of the end of April. Of those, a little bit more than half are individual, 450 are individual sole source or sole source contracts to individual owned firms. That's 323 to native owned firms. That includes tribal, ANC, and Native Hawaiian. And then 200 of those 235 are to Alaska Native Corporation owned firms. So, uh, individual owned firms are still the large number of 8A firms, so they're still getting the large number of 8A sole sources. A very considerable number to ANCs, and then a smaller number to the tribes and Native Hawaiians. If you look at the number of sole sources by firms, though, that's dominated by the native-owned firms. So I looked up all the sole source 8A contracts in fiscal year 2026, and the number to each individual owned firm. The top one is Shenega Government Mission Solutions. It's won 19 8A sole source contracts in fiscal year 2026, and of course, that's a native firm. The top three actually are all native firms. You have to go, so the top one got 19. That's Shenega Government Mission Solutions. You have to go all the way to number four to find the first individual owned firm. That's a firm called Aledo or Aledo. I think I saw that it's out of Arlington, if I got that correct. They got eight A sole sources, and then if you go all the way to, let's see, the top 16, that's the only one that's individual owned. So the bulk of the multiple 8A sole source award winners are native owned firms, especially when you're above five. The top two individual ones are Aledo with eight, and then the next ones have four. So not a whole lot. They're kind of being spread very evenly across individual owned firms, maybe just because there's so many more of those. So thank you, Major Clark, for that question. I got another question on that post about 8A sole sources being created from Bill Elmore. He used to be at SBA in the Veterans Office. He said he'd be interested in the White House's procurements and how those have progressed. And just in time, the New York Times did an investigative story to answer Bill's question about how the 8A, or not 8A, but how the White House's procurements are going. There's a article published by David Fahrenholt, Luke Broadwater, and Andrea Fuller titled "The Firm Building Trump's Ballroom Got a Secret No-Bid Contract for a Nearby Job." The National Park Service increased the value of the contract several times over and then awarded it to Maryland-based Clark Construction in a process that experts said was highly unusual. So the circumstances were Lafayette Park across from the White House. The contract was originally awarded by the Biden administration for $3 million, and then to Clark Construction, but then Trump. Sorry. The Biden administration estimated it at $3 million. Excuse me. They estimated it at $3 million. Is awarded to Clark for about $12 million, and then got increased to $17 million. So well above the estimate and even above the original award amount. And this same firm that's building the ballroom, I guess the suggestion in here is they're getting extra money for the park because they're working on the ballroom. Now, it's not said in those sort of terms out here, but that seems to be the suggestion here that quoting Steve Schooner and others about how this is really unusual to see, first of all, a sole source contract for the repair of a park, because it's not like somebody's going to die because the park's in bad shape. And also that there'd be such a large increase in the amount of the park. So I'll put a link to that very well researched story into the chat or into the show notes. And question from the chat now, people who are on the live stream. Michael Mataccio asks, what are your thoughts on when SBA will return to proceeding with sending out approvals and denials for 8A certifications? Did I check this week? It's been August 15th, 2025 for so long that I don't always check because it's kind of boring if it's the same every time. Let me go in and check. But it's been a really long time since SBA has sent approvals. But that's also interesting to hear that maybe they haven't been sending denials as well. Uh, I've heard from some firms, people just contact me and say, look, I've heard that I'm even in the last step of the 8A process, but I still haven't gotten anything on my 8A application. It seems like if there's enough people that have had this happen to them, they should bring some sort of request to SBA. There is a rule, a regulation that says SBA will decide applications within 90 days. So if there are companies that are out there that have been waiting for years in some of these cases, they're definitely past that 90-day period. Here, let me go in and check the database to see what the last firm is. Let's see, 430. No, I mean, no, no prediction on our part. Certainly, I can't tell you what SBA is gonna do. It seems like I guess I can say that probably the staff that's doing the applications is the same staff that's doing the suspensions and terminations. That may be wrapping up. So to the extent that the suspensions that shifted the application processing to the suspension processing, maybe those people can shift back to the application processing. And I have found that yes, the most recent firm still remains a firm that was certified August 15th, 2025, at least according to the SBA search website. Still have August 15th, 2025 as the most recent firm. And then a comment or question from David Tim. How quickly do you expect SBA to issue a new size determination after an OHA remand? It varies a lot. You can see a case. There's a case like 6 months ago where OHA had remanded to the area office. That was a size case, and I think it was to find the firm other than small. But it was 9 months, and the firm still hadn't gotten the remand decision from the area office. So OHA, in a very rare type of case, I've never seen one like that, just declared the firm to be whatever it was for small or other than small. I'll have to go back and find that case. But in that case, it was 9 months. There was another remand case recently, the one involving JP Morgan, and saying that JP Morgan was a investor with negative control in a company, and that was a remand as well. So you could check in to see how long SBA took to decide the remand in that case. All right, that's all I have. Thanks for joining me for data and case law updates, legislative updates, tracking the SBA budget, goings on within the SBA Office of Advocacy, etc. Keep your questions coming. I'll have another podcast next week with Scott Flesh. We'll be going over the recent bid protests and the executive order. So feel free to take a look at that, comment on it, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks for joining, everybody.